You're listening to The Other 50%, a history of Hollywood. I'm Julie Harris Walker. This is the podcast where we talk to successful women in entertainment and hear their stories. So this is a first. In this episode, I got to speak with Shelly Bond, a comic book editor who is creating Femme Magnifique, a comic book anthology honoring women. I didn't even realize that being a comic book editor was a thing, but it totally is, and hearing Shelly talk about it is amazing. And since she references it, I will confess we met in our tap class. It's much cooler than you think, but don't ask us to tap in public because it's not going to happen and you're never going to see it. Just trust me, we are really good. You can find us at theother50%.com, and you can also go there to buy the Other 50% merchandise. I know you want a t-shirt. You can also find us on iTunes, Facebook, on Twitter at Other50%, and on Instagram at Other50% Podcast. We now have a sister podcast called The Other 50%, a history of tech. You can also find it on iTunes or on the same website. That's where I talk to successful women in tech and hear their stories. Okay, here's Shelly. So what is your job?
My job is editing and curating an amazing Kickstarter anthology called Femme Magnifique.
What is that?
It is a reaction to a missed opportunity for women. And by that I mean last November, when the election results came in and shocked most of the nation, I thought it was really time for the people in the comic book community to step up. And I made a call to arms to some friends of mine who run HiFi Color Design, which is the comic book coloring production company. And I suggested that we kickstart an anthology and call in over 100 of the most talented creators in the comic book industry and also from other disciplines, and take what I felt was a lot of negativity on Twitter and Facebook and online and channel it into something positive, and come together and put an anthology together that salutes women from pop, politics, the arts, and sciences.
In comic book form?
In comic book form.
I love it!
So the idea is that each writer would suggest a person who inspires them, and we would hook up that writer with an artist who would help them bring their story to life. But it's much more than a wiki entry. It kind of sounds like a wiki entry, but it's not, because I'm asking people to dig deep and to pick one person who has really made a difference in their lives, one female who changed the game for them. And these women come from all walks of life. They are from present day or from the past.
Can you give an example?
Sure. We have a wonderful writer, Chuck Brown, who is doing a story about Harriet Tubman, which I think is terrific. His artist is Sanford Green, who is a phenomenal cartoonist. And what I love about this story is that it's so timely. I think the historical figures that kids learn about in school sometimes only get a real cursory summary about who they are and what they've done. But so many women from history continue to enlighten and empower us today.
They're still relevant.
Absolutely. But that said, we're not just looking at people from history. We're looking at people of today. For instance, Tess Fowler, who is an incredible young artist in the comic book industry, is also a great writer. And she was actually the first person I contacted because she is really bold on Twitter, and she has very strong political views. She's a feminist, and she's just an all-around badass. And I knew I wanted to get her to write and draw a story for me. When I reached out to her, she said that her Femme Magnifique was Cat Black. Now, this was a young woman that I never heard of before, and it turns out she's a YouTube gender activist, but she's also an artist, and she has done incredible work all over the country. She speaks at universities and colleges and high schools, and just as a tremendous humanitarian and an advocate for gay rights and equality. So the first story that I commissioned was from Tess Fowler, and it's incredible.
What's your background? How are you leading the ship?
Well, I've been a comic book editor for almost a quarter of a century, and I don't want you to do the math. That would be very unfair. As I've told you before, I have the face for radio, so don't look too closely as you're speaking with me. But I have been in the comic book industry since 1988. I did not set out to be a comic book editor.
Yeah, how did you know you wanted to get into comic books at all?
Well, it wasn't anything that I loved when I was a child. I confess I really loved the Peanuts gang, and I remember reading Charlie Brown and Snoopy in book form when I was a kid, and maybe the occasional Archie comic, but I really didn't have any aspirations to be a comic book editor, and in fact, I didn't even know that was a job.
Yeah, I didn't know that was a job until I met you.
Oh, well, thanks. I'm so glad. I think you probably know what my dream was. I think from when I was a really young girl, I wanted to be a professional tap dancer. But sadly, I never made it over the 5'1" mark.
Cannot be a Rockette unless you're 5'7".
I cannot.
I have looked into this.
I have to tell you something. That was a devastating blow when I was 13 years old. So I definitely had other aspirations, but mostly I wanted to become an auteur, and I wanted to be a filmmaker. So I went to college to study film, television, and audio production.
Where'd you go?
I went to Ithaca College in upstate New York, and I discovered comics in college. I took a screenwriting class, and it was in my senior year. It was one of those classes 3 days a week, 8 o'clock in the morning, and no one showed up.
I hardly ever went to that class.
I know. I have a feeling you would totally not be the person who would make it, but I was studious. My parents always said that I cost them twice as much money as my sister. I went to a private college. She went to a state school. I was the one who was the hobbyist. My sister did nothing but read. So I have to laugh because I took advantage of everything my college had to offer. I was working at the cable news station at an internship as an editor and a camera operator. I was a DJ at our college radio station, which was really cool, alternative music. And I really just, I studied, I enjoyed writing papers, I did well, and this was a class that changed my life. It was screenwriting, and the teacher one day showed us a comic book called Empire Lanes, and it was by a writer-artist named Peter Gross. And he showed us this comic and said that it was a great way to study the fine art of storytelling. And I had no idea that their comic books even still existed. I assumed they were all superhero books and that they were old. I didn't even know there really were comic book stores anymore. So as my eyeballs were popping out over this incredible art that I was looking at, there was a kid in my class who nudged me on the shoulder and said, "Hey, if you like comic books, there's a comic book store in town. I used to work there. I'll show you around." So sure enough, I walked into the comic book store, and this was 1987, and it was the time when there was this great comic book boom where all of these independent companies were putting out with black and white books and putting out really edgy, provocative material, not superhero content. Let me make that clear. I was never a superhero comic book reader or editor. I was always into like the stranger side of comics, more the arty side. So when I walked into the comic book store and I saw these incredible books jumping off the shelves into my arms, I couldn't believe this was actually like a possibility that these books were out there. And I bought as many as I could afford at the time. I bought Love and Rockets, Bill Sienkiewicz's and Frank Miller's Electra Assassin, Moon Shadow. Grendel was a real game changer for me. That was by a writer-artist named Matt Wagner, who's also doing me a solid and participating in Femme Magnifique. But his book...
Someone you discovered in college?
I discovered his work in college. He's not much older than me. I have to say that for the record. He's really not much older than me. But there's just some wonderful irony here, because his comic book, Grendel, I believe was on issue 16 when I was in college. And I picked up the issue, and it just blew my mind. It was instantly my favorite comic. A year later, I would be working at that comic book company that published Grendel. It was called Comico, the comic company. That was my first job out of college, and that was the book that really propelled me into the career I have now.
And then there you were working with that artist at your first job?
I worked with him to the extent that I answered the phone and I would transfer his call.
And sometimes he would call.
And he called and he made my knees knock. He was the nicest guy. He was so supportive and so cool. I was living in Philadelphia at the time, and Comico was located in Norristown, Pennsylvania. So the short story is that I graduated from college. I spent the summer as a DJ, and as much as I loved it in college, I hated it in the real world because I was working like from 4 to midnight for an AM station, and it was pushing buttons. It was boring. So I convinced my dad to move me to Philadelphia, and I told him to give me a month. If I didn't have a job, he could take me home. But sure enough, I got to Philadelphia, and a block away from my apartment was a comic book store. And the first day I walked in to get my weekly comics, the manager said they were looking for an editorial assistant at Comico. So I was, of course, interested. I sent my resume over, and thankfully I got the job. It was a reverse commute, so I lived in Center City, and I commuted 52 minutes on a train each way and walked 2 miles to a dilapidated house in Norristown.
In the winter, in the snow, both
yes,
ways uphill.
Yes, up the hill backwards and everything. And I did that until the company actually declared Chapter 7. But it was a good 2 years, and it was trial by fire, and it was just the best education in how to put a comic book together. And I have to say, I was hired by some terrific people who I'm always grateful for. Diana Schutz gave me my first job, and she was a highly regarded editor in the field, and so she really showed me the ropes. But when she and her husband at the time left the company, the owner of the company asked me and also the art director, Rick Taylor, if we wanted to stay and if he wanted to be the art department and if I wanted to be the editorial department. And I was 23 years old, and I thought I could conquer the world. So I said, of course.
Yeah.
So he gave me a $1,500 raise. You can only imagine how little I was earning at the time. My parents, I have to thank them here for supporting me in those years because it was impossible to survive. I could barely afford the train fare. And Rick Taylor and I really ran Comico for over a year with our publisher and with all the wonderful freelancers that helped us. But Rick was my true mentor. He was my partner in crime. And I've also invited Rick to join me in this project, Femme Magnifique. He's going to be coloring a story, and it's just so amazing to work with him again.
How great is this, that you can really reconnect with all the people you collected throughout your career and do this project?
It's astounding. I started at Comico. When I left Comico, I didn't immediately stay in comics. I stayed in Philadelphia. I worked a little bit as a talent agent, but I eventually got a job at DC Comics. So in 1992, December 12th to be exact, I was hired to be a part of the Vertigo line, which was an imprint of DC Comics that changed the face of modern comics. And I was so honored to be a part of the team. And for 23 and a half years, I went from assistant editor to executive editor and just had a tremendous career, basically thanks to the people that I was able to work with and who supported me all those years. Wow. Not just Karen Berger, who gave me my start and trusted me and promoted me every chance that I earned it and championed all my ideas, but also the amazing writers and artists who stuck with me, who believed in me just as much as I believed in them.
And this is how you met your husband also, isn't it?
It is how I met my husband. I know.
Tell us that.
This is one of those stories where you might just go, gag, it's way too cute. But when I started working at Vertigo, I was working on a book called Shade the Changing Man, and I was a fan of the book before I started there, but not a super fan. I walked in and noticed that there was a duo of artists, 2 young British artists named Glyn Dillon and Shelly Bond, and they were helping out on an issue of Shade, and I was unfamiliar with their work because they were helping out on a special new issue. So I took one look at their work, and I instantly fell in love. They both had similar but distinctive art styles, very pop, very cool. You could tell that these were the kind of guys you wanted to hang out with based on their drawings.
Wow.
You could also tell the kind of music they liked, and I was all about British music.
Wait, you can tell all that just from looking at their drawings?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so you have an eye.
Well,
I cannot see such things in drawings.
I think if I showed you their artwork, you would also be blown away. And I will say that their stuff was very distinctive from everything else that was out there. They were part of this very hip group of British talent, and they worked on what was a Deadline. It was called Deadline. It was a comics magazine that was really the epitome. It was kind of equivalent to like New Musical Express magazine. It was like the hipster magazine of comics. So Philip and Glyn were roommates, and they went to art school together, and they we're helping out on Shade, and I said to my boss that day, who is Philip Bond? He's my new favorite artist. And she said, well, Philip and Glenn are talented, but they're very slow. You know, they're like right out of art school and they work paycheck to paycheck and they're not really interested in doing too much work. I said, okay, wait till I get my hands on them. So a couple of years go by and I would hire Glenn and Philip whenever I could. They didn't always work together, but I would hire them for small jobs because when I did give them longer assignments, they just couldn't deliver. And it would be
It did take forever.
It took forever and it was tragic. But over the years, I would see them at conventions. I would take them both out for dinner or lunch, and we'd hang out and we'd go out for drinks. And it's funny to look back because Philip and I were always friends. And there was never anything romantic between us, but I recall that there was a time in 1996 where I went to a convention and my favorite filmmaker had a new film out that year. It was Mike Leigh, and it was the movie Naked, which I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's not a date movie. It's like really violent and horrible in a good way. So I remember after I took everyone out for dinner and bought them each like 6 rounds of beer, I said, I'm going to see a movie. Does anyone want to come with me? My treat. And Philip put his hand up. And it should be said that of this group of guys, he was like the shy beetle. He didn't ever say very much. He was like the tallest guy and the coolest guy and the best artist, but he didn't say much. He seemed like he was enjoying himself, but who knows? So he raised his hand, and I was like, all right. So I'll never forget, we went to the movie, nothing happened, but there was definitely a time where I looked over to my right, and I was like, he's kind of cute, but I like working with him.
You don't want to mess that up.
I didn't want to mess that up, and Philip tells me that like he thought the same thing, but he was so shy. He said he was sweating during the whole movie anyway.
And you were the boss, right?
I was the boss.
Yeah.
Although, you know, I'm barely 5'2", and he's 6'2", so like he could have crushed me. He could have sneezed, and I would have just like fallen down, knocked myself out. But that was an interesting moment. But the real turning point for the relationship happened on a book called The Invisibles, and that one is by comic book Apocalypse, Grant Morrison. If you don't know that name, it's a name you really should look up because The Invisibles, to me, is his masterwork in comics. And it was designed as a trilogy. And he had said to my boss at the time that he only wanted Philip Bond to do a certain storyline. It was a 6-issue storyline, and that's who he wanted to work on this particular story. So my boss said to me, you're going to have to hire Philip Bond to work on this job. And I said, I can't believe you're telling me this. For years I tried to give him more work and you said no. And she said, make it happen. This is what Grant wants.
I guess. Okay.
I was like, it's not going to be easy. She's like, make it happen. It can't be late. So we started talking twice a day on the phone. And then when I realized that Oreos were not easy to actually locate back then, we're talking like 1998, 1999.
And he was living in England.
He was living in England. He was living on the south coast in Worthing, which is like 10 minutes from Brighton. So I would send him care packages, and it started with lots of Oreos. That was like a really like big deal. I think the British guys just like had this love for like certain types of American candy and cookies, even though their chocolate is far superior.
Way better. I hope he was sending you Cadbury's.
Well, he really wasn't actually, because he was pretty broke. But we were exchanging mixtapes. And I think that you probably know that's sort of where it all starts.
For everybody, is
right?
The mixtape. Yeah.
And we had so many like musical heroes from Bowie and Eno. We loved Roxy Music. And also we liked a lot of the sort of 80s British indie bands. So it was cool. We had a lot in common. And so you can imagine what happened. We talked twice a day. We sent each other packages. And he got the work done almost on time. Very close in some cases. But yeah, we brought the book to fruition. And when we saw each other at a convention after the book came out, we just sort of celebrated. We had a lot of fun and we hung out. And I think we realized we were falling in love, but the inciting incident, and I'm sorry this is so long, but it's
the inciting
incident happened because of Berlin. I had always wanted to go to Berlin. I'm a huge David Bowie fan, and Station to Station is my favorite album. So after this particular convention, I had a ticket to Berlin, and I was going by myself. and there was some unrest there at the time. And my father called me at my hotel, and he said, I have a bad feeling, don't go to Berlin. And I was like, no, I've been waiting for this trip my whole life. And he said, look, I will pay for you your ticket and anything you want to do in London. Don't go to Berlin. I hung up the phone, and I said to Philip, who was like just hanging out with me, having a coffee, I was supposed to go to Berlin, and now I am not. And I have nothing to do for the next 4 days. And he said, want to hang out? So we did. And we fell in love. And that was just really where it happened. And a month later, after I came home, we were talking every day, and I said, look, come see Manhattan, stay on my couch, no strings. And he never left.
He came to visit and stayed forever.
Pretty much. I mean, there was a little back and forth, but we got married 8 months later, and it'll be 17 years married in May. So yeah, it can happen to you. You can fall in love with your favorite comic book artist and then yank him over from across the pond and have a great life.
That is a great story.
Thanks. He's also contributing to Femme Magnifique.
Now, who's he doing his story on?
Well, he is known for his drawings of female astronauts. I'm not jealous, by the way. He draws the most beautiful female astronauts. He loves space. He wanted to be an astrophysicist when he was really young, and he's just fascinated with all things space-related. So he and writer Cecil Castellucci have a story in the book about Sally Ride, which is tremendous.
That is great. What other artists do you have lined up?
What's so amazing about Femme Magnifique is the breadth and depth of material and the exceptional writers and artists who are bringing these stories to life. Not only do we have icons from the comic book industry, Bill Sienkiewicz is a force to be reckoned with. He has been in comics longer than me, but I'm certain he's younger than me. He is astounding and continues to up his game. I was lucky enough to get him to write and draw a story for this book. He hasn't, to my knowledge, hasn't really written and drawn anything for quite a while, so it is an honor to have his work in Femme Magnifique. But we also have some rising stars. One of my greatest joys of being a comic book editor is uniting disparate talent from all over the world. So I have a wonderful British writer who I'm matching up with a talented young artist who's based in India. And I have a literature prize winner named Sunny Liu, who I hired right out of art school, who's doing a tremendous story on Elizabeth Choi. He lives in Singapore. So this is a book that is going to reach all different ages, all different cultures. It's going to represent, and it really stands about equality. It's a salute to women of the world to say, look what you've done. We honor you for it. Let's encourage all the young women of today to go for it, crack ceilings, change the game, live your dream, and you can be anything you really want to be. I had no idea that there was such a thing as a comic book editor's job out there, and it is the greatest job that no one knows about. And I'm sure there are other jobs that young women aren't even aware of. So in addition this book is meant to educate about people from the past, women who are currently changing the game, and also to inspire young adults to just dream big and to continue to pay it forward for future generations.
I love it. Are there a lot of women doing what you do in the comic book world?
I wouldn't say there are a lot. When I first started, there was really a small handful. I mean, I've really existed in the locker room for a very long time, but it's really never bothered me. I came in with my own vision from the get-go, and I've been lucky because I've met a lot of people who don't like playing by the rules and who are not afraid to step up, bring on their A game, and innovate. So
Is it kind of a rebel industry?
I guess in some ways it is. I mean, you will always have a part of the comic book industry that's boys, old school. They only like superheroes. They like seeing women run in stilettos and wear plunging necklines and body parts that are not even possible with plastic. But I think what's most exciting about the comic book industry is the other side. You know, it's a medium that's unlike any other. And I think that's what's fascinating to me about it. You have to decide, is something better brought to life if you say it or show it? And that's where the words and pictures become a great challenge and become interesting, because it's not just one or the other. I remember Neil Gaiman, the writer of Sandman, and of course many other fantasy novels. I remember he once said to me, the comic book is such a unique experience. And as a writer, he said when he writes prose, it's really just the writer and the reader. It's a very intimate experience. It's just two of you there. It's the reader and what's going on in the reader's mind. But the comic book is a collaboration with so many people, because you have the writer, you have the artist, the letterer, the colorist, the logo designer, the cover artist, and of course the editor.
And those are all different people.
They're all different people. Sometimes the writer and artist are the same person, but when you're talking about a monthly book, you need a lot of people to keep it going. Because a comic book, I like to say a comic book is alive, especially a monthly. It's on a schedule. You know, it should come out every 30 days, so you need to get some long lead time. But you need to keep it going. You need to keep it watered and fed, and you need to keep every person on the team inspired. Because if it stops, there's trouble. So it's the editor's job to keep many plates in the air. Being a comic book editor is the greatest job that no one knows about. You're master control, but you have to be a Jack or Jill of all trades. You have to be the master of a lot of things, and what you don't know, you have to fake. What I mean by that is, when you're a comic book editor, you have to have your thumbprint all over everything. There's so many moving parts. So you are part cheerleader, part art director, part copy editor, part psychiatrist. You have to make sure that you give deadlines and you're not afraid to be a good cop, or you're not afraid to be a bad cop. Because one of the most important jobs that an editor has is knowing who to hire. When you hire the right person, they should deliver the job. But if they don't, then you have to fire. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't like to do. But to me, when there's so many lives at stake, you have a lot of people hired, they're expecting to be paid, they want to feed their families, there's no excuse for missing a deadline.
You gotta make it happen.
You gotta make it happen.
And you're dealing with artists.
And you're dealing with artists, exactly.
It's a tricky balance.
Although I have to say that everyone in the comic book industry is unique in their temperaments. So somebody just the other day told me they thought I was an anthropologist because I have so many different personality types to deal with, including my own. You know, there's ego, there's reputation. Yeah. You have to just really be able to juggle and manage. I can liken it to waitressing in some ways, but waitressing for a banquet hall of thousands. And it's invigorating.
So walk us through, like, if you were to put out an issue of a book, I'm going to make it up what I think it would be, is that you would have a meeting with all your people, like a story meeting. Do you all discuss, like, here's what's going to happen, like, here's the story arc?
Well, it's
and then go.
It's less of a writer's room. I think what you're describing sounds more like TV.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking of.
What's wonderful about comics is that it's intimate. It starts small. Sometimes I will call a writer, cold call, and ask them if they want to write comics. Sometimes that writer might not even know that comic books are still around, kind of like I was back in college. Other times it's a writer who I notice in his or her prose name drops one of the comic books I've edited. That happened with Cecil Castellucci. She actually name-dropped Preacher, which was a Vertigo comic. I didn't edit it, for the record, but I certainly was a reader, and it was part of the Vertigo line. So when she name-dropped a Vertigo comic, I knew she was cool, and I knew that she probably had pretty strong interest in comics. So I reached out to her, and that's how I find interesting people to bring them into the field. So it's not... I would say that most writers I work with are not people who grew up reading comics as kids. A lot of those people write superhero comics, and that's fine for them, but not for me.
So then is the writer kind of in charge of where the story goes?
Often the writer comes in and has a good idea or an outline, and we sort of hone it together. If the writer comes in with an artist attached, often it's a creator-owned book, so they both have input. But as the editor, my job is to really bring out the best in all the talent that's involved. But the editor and the writer have that really first close relationship. And in some cases, I've had so many talented writers work with me over the years. I've had writers who pitch me things that from a sentence I want to buy. One of those projects was Fables by Bill Willingham. And Bill was a writer who I met back at Comico back in the late 80s. And at that time, he was living in a van. He was very elusive. He owed the company a lot of scripts, and he wasn't delivering. And his book, The Elementals, was one of the few books that was bringing in any money to Comico at the time. So I had to hire a friend of his to be a detective and find out where he was so I could track him down to get script pages out of him. Meanwhile, he impressed me so much as a writer. He did a book that was basically pastiche on superheroes. And it was 20 years ahead of its time because you see so many satires now about the superhero comic or about superhero characters. And he was doing it long before a lot of people did it in the 90s. And I always thought he was a genius, even though he had no idea who I was. He thought I was just some kid telling him, which I was. When I got the job at DC Comics, I looked him up, and he was shocked.
He was in a van down by the river.
You know what? You would think so. But he actually settled down in Vegas at that point.
Oh.
So he was having a good old time at the casinos. He was a proposition player at the time. So he was still elusive in his own way. But I said, pitch something to me. We worked on a few books. But when it came to the series Fables, which I think was the inspiration for so many of those fairy tale shows on TV, like Once Upon a Time and Grimm. So Fables came first. Fables was pitched to me on the phone. Bill and I were chatting, and I said, what do you have? What's new? And he said, well, the thing I'm working on that I really love, I don't think you're going to like. And of course, me being me, I said, what is it, Bill?
Yeah, try me.
And he said, oh, it's about fairy tale characters who were exiled from their homelands, and now they're living in New York City in a secret society, and they're learning to deal with life in contemporary times and how to live with their magic. And I said, I want that.
Sold.
Yes. And it happened fast, and it was my longest-running title. In fact, I think it's the longest-running creator-owned title, certainly at Vertigo and DC Comics, one of the longest-running in comics. It clocks in at 150 issues. The last issue of the book was this 22nd volume trade, and I put it out as one issue, one volume. So it's not unlike what I'm doing on Femme Magnifique, in the sense that I have a really nice thick volume of short stories, 3-page stories that fill up this tremendous book, you know, from cover to cover. It's just chock full of amazing inspirational stories about women who empower and change the game.
How long do you think it will take to get it out?
Well, right now we're in the middle of funding, and we're on day 3. It's been steady, but we could use more support. I think with a lot of Kickstarters, or I'm finding, because I'm a neophyte, it's pretty good the first day because it's news and everybody's excited, but it slows down because it's a lot of work to get the word out. So I'm really, really hoping that we get funded. We have a 30-day campaign. If we're funded, it will probably take about 3 months, and we see a book being ready in September.
Exciting.
Yeah, very exciting.
Okay, I'm going to put a link to your Kickstarter on my website. Do you have any partners in this, or are you doing this by yourself?
I can't say that I'm doing this all on my own. I have tremendous partners on Femme Magnifique. My co-curators in crime are a husband-wife duo, Kristy and Brian Miller of HiFi Color Design. They both own this amazing comic book coloring company, and they agreed to work with me on this. So we're like a 3-headed beast, a gorgon to some. Brian is the artist creative side of the company, and he's colored so many comic books for me over the years, and he's a terrific artist in his own right. And Kristy is not only the tough business owner and schedule coordinator and deadline cruncher, pretty much the mastermind of HiFi's business side, but she's also an anthropologist, so her input in Femme Magnifique is critical.
Yeah.
She has been really helping us with outreach to educators. In fact, we have a teacher's edition, and that edition on Kickstarter not only gets you, of course, the book, but there are some extra teaching materials. There's a homework assignment guide, and we're hoping we can actually even print a few different comic book panel grids in the book so that students can actually have their own chance to write and draw a 3-page story to salute their own Femme Magnifique.
Oh, what a great idea.
So in addition to that, Kristy is also an amazing tennis pro. So she's the trifecta, and she is doing such great work in helping us co-curate. But of course, I'm the lucky one who gets to be called the editor of the book. So for me, bringing in over 100 of my favorite comic book artists and writers in comics and outside comics is such a great pleasure. As I've said, it's the greatest joy for a comic book editor to read someone's prose and instantly think of a great artistic collaborator and to bring those two people together to create something magnificent on the page. And that's exactly what we're doing with Femme Magnifique.
That sounds so fun.
Yay, it is. It's the best.
Okay, now tell me this. Are you a success?
A success at this particular juncture or at my tap
Shelly
dancing?
Bond as a human.
I claim to not have an ego, and I'm not a center stage kind of person. I'm a behind the scenes. I like to prop other people up and make them look good. I am not afraid to wield a red pen. I'm not afraid to say no. I'm not afraid to kick someone in the teeth to get better work out of them. Am I a success? I'd like to think so. I work really hard. I am not one to do anything halfway. I'm either in it completely or not at all. So I'll say yes.
Okay, and I think you just answered my second question too, which is, are you a badass?
Beyond badass. I think despite my diminutive size, people are pretty afraid of me. That's what I'm told.
Afraid of you? Why?
They should be. Because I will never be afraid
They
will never be afraid to art direct them. I will never be afraid to tell them to kill their darlings. And I will never be afraid to tell them just to man up and do the work.
You are not intimidated.
I am not intimidated at all. And in fact, I'll share a terrific response from one of our Q&As. All of our writers and artists were asked to give us their bio information, and I gave them a list of 20 questions and asked them to answer 3. My favorite response came from probably our most famous writer, Kelly Sue DeConnick, who is one of the writers on Emerald City. She is the terrific creator and writer of Bitch Planet, which has taken over the comics community by storm. It's one of the most talked about series of the past few years. And I asked Kelly Sue what the best advice was that she could give a young, aspiring comic book writer or artist. And she said, 3 words, do the work. And I think that just says it all. And it's true. If you want to get ahead, get it done. I tell students all the time when I'm reviewing portfolios or when I'm visiting a school and asked to give a lecture, number one thing you need to do is show up. There are people that talk about getting involved in comics. There are people that say that they don't think they're talented enough. Prove that you've got an interest. Show up, do the job, go to conventions, talk to professionals whose work you admire, ask a question, write a short note, but always do your research. If you get the opportunity to meet an editor, make sure you know who she is and what she's edited so that you can actually tell her why you like her work. And I think you'll find that the comic book industry, even though it's grown significantly over the years, it's still a tight-knit club. And I think you'll find that so many of us sort of started grassroots and really sort of got ahead because there were people that helped us, that gave us a boost. And so I know, myself, for one, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to get some new writers and artists into Femme Magnifique. I wanted them to kind of get a chance to exist in this beautiful body of work with some of the most impressive names in the comic book industry. So how fantastic is that?
It's incredible.
To get the opportunity to work with some of these other professionals. I also find that when I unite a new writer with a seasoned artist or vice versa, they really tend to rub off on each other, because you have a novice who is learning at every stage, as long as they're open and willing, learning the craft, not only from the editor, but from their partner in the comic book story. And then you have the seasoned pro who maybe is a little set in his ways and maybe could actually use a bit of energy, a bit of new blood, and some moxie and verve, which I have to say I find in spades from a particular group of young female writers and artists. A lot of those people are represented in Femme Magnifique. There's one young woman in particular named teal-haired, who I predict is going to be the next sensation in comics. She is absolutely fearless in her writing. She is full of verve and moxie, and she has a story about a female beatnik named Diane de Prima that is tremendous. It's drawn by Ming Doyle, who is a very familiar name in the comic book community, and I think the two of them are just going to be a powerhouse on their story.
I can't wait.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you for having me on your show.
You've been listening to The Other 50%. I'm Julie Harris Walker. I'd like to thank Shelly Bond for sharing her story. Go contribute to her Kickstarter. The link is on the website, theother50%.com. And special thanks to Jonathan Lucas for editing, Jay Rowe, Danny Rosner, and Allison McQuaid for the music. Please find us on iTunes and subscribe and leave a review. And of course, our website, theother50%.com, all spelled out, for added features, bios of our guests, and the merch. You can also follow us on Facebook, on Twitter at Other50%, and Instagram at Other50% Podcast. And don't forget to check out The Other 50%, a Herstory of Tech. Thanks for listening. See you next time.